Speranza is the director of the Transatlantic Defense and Security Program at the Center for European Policy Analysis, and she joins us now live from Washington, D.C. for more. Thank you so much for joining us here on the program today. Now, we are aware that NATO is worried of the potential use of nuclear weapons and, of course, a spillover of the conflict into a member state like Poland. What can we expect to come out of this meeting that they're expected to hold tomorrow?
Well, thanks so much for having me. There are really four things that I think are the goals of this summit. The first is really to keep up the show of unity. The alliance has shown remarkable solidarity so far in the face of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But the longer that the war wages on, the more difficult it is to keep allies all on the same page about what to do. The second goal is really to commit to providing more assistance to Ukraine. So that will come in both the form of military aid, but also humanitarian assistance. And I think the alliance will look to make a more long-term commitment rather than just ad hoc deliveries, which we've seen so far. The third is really about agreeing to new ways to punish Russia. So I expect that we'll see a new announcement of more sanctions on Russia, perhaps targeting Russian lawmakers, which is one of the proposals coming from the US. Although this will be increasingly difficult given Europe's energy dependence on Russia. So I think part of the discussions will be about how to reduce Europe's dependence on Russian energy. And then finally, I think there will be talk about how to adapt NATO's strategy and force posture long term, as you mentioned already, perhaps considering some more permanent deployments to the eastern flank, and possibly how to respond if Putin were to escalate the war in Ukraine further, for instance, with a potential chemical weapons or tactical nuclear weapons attack.
Already ruled out the possibility of implementing a no-fly zone over Ukraine, and Poland is expected to propose the deployment of peacekeepers during the meeting tomorrow. But Lavrov has already warned against this. Is that a risk NATO would be willing to take?
I think there is relatively low appetite within the alliance to deploy some kind of peacekeeping force, especially under the auspices of NATO, even if its mission is solely humanitarian and it's designed to create a sort of non-conflict zone to help refugees and provide aid. You know, most allies see that as an escalation by putting Western forces on the ground. And so we've heard the US sort of pour cold water on that proposal. So I think it's up for discussion, but I doubt that we will see approval of that through NATO.
Zelensky says he's willing to give up joining NATO if Russia stops its offensive. Why does Russia see NATO as a major threat to its security to go to the extent of starting this conflict in Ukraine? Or is it that it's just a guise Russia's using to accomplish another goal?
Right. Well, it's clear that this conflict was never really about NATO. NATO was the excuse that Russia used, but this is about the entire security order in Europe and about Russia's place in the world and Vladimir Putin's desire to gain back what was formerly its sphere of influence and to increase Russia's standing on the world stage, to gain back territory and essentially go back to empire building. And it does not believe that Ukraine should exist as a sovereign state. And so all of these things underpin Putin's decision to undertake the war. I do think that the security guarantees question is really tough, because if there is not desire to admit Ukraine to the alliance, you know, what kind of guarantees could we actually provide Ukraine if it is not guaranteed that Article 5 collective defense clause that would ensure that all allies would come to its defense? So I think that is now the key question that would be at the center of these negotiations between the West and Russia and Ukraine.
You mentioned sanctions, Lauren. How divided in opinion do you think member states are when it comes to sanctioning, particularly Russian gas and oil? Because that's where the money's at.
Right. Well, there has been remarkable unity on sanctions so far. And I think the package that the West has issued is sort of at about a 7 or 8 out of 10 on the scale of sanctions. And it was implemented very quickly. So the West ought to be commended. Both the United States and European allies and partners, and even countries beyond Europe, have joined in on these sanctions. So I think there is a high degree of support across all of the allies for the most part. As you said, I think the major flashpoint going forward will be the energy question, especially, we've seen reluctance for Europe, especially to ban Russian oil and gas imports, which Europe needs. And if they are to agree to those bans, what we could see is an energy crisis on the continent, which would send energy prices soaring worldwide and would create a much more dire situation. So, now the task is, and there are some allies that are more keen to explore these options than others, but now the task is to figure out how do we offset Europe's need, whether that comes from additional American resources or other countries that do not rely on Russia's supply.
All right, Lauren Speranza, thank you so much for that outstanding analysis. It was a pleasure speaking to you.
Thanks so much for having me.